the heart of this nation, under skies so blue,
there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true.
from the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe.
Ever feel like you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg with world events? That there's deeper stuff moving things along?
Absolutely. And today we're diving into one of those undercurrents that's really picked up steam online recently.
Yeah, we're looking at a big Twitter thread from Data Republican. It focuses on George Soros and what the thread calls an evil AF playbook. Strong words.
Very strong. And it got noticed, too. Twitchy ran an article highlighting it, so it definitely broke out of just a small corner of the internet.
Right. So our goal here isn't to, just react to the headline. We want to unpack what the thread is actually saying.
Exactly. What are the core arguments? What's the source material? It points to a 1993 essay by George Soros himself called Toward a New World Order, The Future of NATO.
Okay, so we'll dig into the claims, look at that essay reference, and try to get a handle on the ideas being presented.
And we should probably acknowledge up front, terms like New World Order, evil playbook, they're loaded.
Definitely. Our job isn't to buy into the hype or dismiss it outright, but to understand the substance of the argument and where it supposedly comes from.
Okay, so where did this thread even start?
Well, Data Republican mentions it came out of a live stream discussion with someone called @MikeBenCyber.
Uh-huh.
And Data Republican is clear. They describe themselves as a tool builder, not like a historian or an academic.
Right. They even say the info is kind of common knowledge for many, which is interesting framing in itself.
It is. Positions it as something already understood in certain circles.
And the key piece of evidence they hang it on is that Soros essay from 1993.
Toward a New World Order, The Future of NATO.
Yeah, written right after the Soviet Union collapsed, a time of massive geopolitical shifts.
That title, though, New World Order, even back in '93, that's a phrase that carries a lot of baggage for some people.
It really does. So according to Data Republican's thread, what's the main argument in that essay?
The thread claims Soros argued NATO needed a new mission after the Cold War. It wasn't just about defense against Russia anymore.
Okay, a new purpose. What was it?
The thread says Soros saw NATO's new role as proactively shaping other countries into open societies.
Shaping them? How?
Well, they quote something attributed to Soros. NATO's new mission is best? Would go out and shape other countries to open societies.
That does suggest a pretty active interventionist role, if that's accurate, a big change from just collective defense.
Exactly. And the thread argues this even redefined peace and security.
How so?
It wasn't just about, lack of war. Peace and security started depending on how many countries were open societies.
Ah, so the internal structure of other countries became a direct NATO concern.
That's the claim. They quote again, peace and security depend first and foremost on a successful transition to open society.
Okay, so if a country isn't transitioning to what this model deems an open society,
Then, according to the thread's interpretation of Soros, it's a potential threat to peace and security.
and the implication drawn in the thread,
Is that if a country doesn't adopt Western-style capitalism and liberalism, free markets, certain democratic norms,
then NATO might need to step in politically, economically.
or even militarily. That's the stark conclusion the thread presents based on its reading.
Wow, okay. Military force to promote a specific societal model. That's quite a claim to attribute.
It is. So then the thread tries to define this open society concept.
Which originally comes from the philosopher Karl Popper, right? About critical thinking, fallibility.
Exactly. Popper's ideas about societies that can change peacefully, admit mistakes. The thread says Soros built on that.
So the theoretical checklist includes things like democracy, free markets, civil rights.
Minority protections, transparency, a global rules-based order. All sounds pretty standard, perhaps.
On paper, yes. But then the thread draws a contrast.
Right. It argues that in practice, an open society, according to this view, really just means a government that agrees with Soros.
So less about the internal mechanics and more about alignment.
That's the interpretation. They quote Soros again. Open society is based on the recognition that participants act on the basis of imperfect understanding, closed society on its denial.
Okay, how does the thread interpret that?
They argue it means accept our specific take on pluralism and Western values, and you're open. If you don't,
Even if you have your own democratic system or cultural norms.
you get labeled closed, and that label, the thread suggests, can be used to justify intervention.
A kind of ideological litmus test, then?
That's the implication drawn, which leads into the role of foreign aid.
Ah, okay. How does that fit in?
The thread claims foreign aid is presented by Soros as a key tool for building these open societies.
Is there a quote for that, too?
Yep. Attributed to Soros. The primary need is for constructive engagement in the transition to democratic, market-oriented open societies.
Constructive engagement. Often a euphemism for aid or diplomatic pressure.
The thread interprets it as money flows to countries that get with the program, basically,
Yeah.
that align with this vision.
And if the money doesn't work?
The thread is blunt. It suggests military intervention is still on the table as a backup if aid fails to create the desired open society.
So aid first, potentially force later.
That's the playbook laid out in the thread, and it leads to this really pointed conclusion.
Which is?
That if you oppose foreign aid, you could find yourself framed. Framed as an agent of a closed society, maybe even an enemy of democracy itself.
Wow. That definitely raises the stakes for policy debates about aid, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
Okay, then the thread tackles who actually runs these theoretical open societies.
And the claim is?
That it's not the citizens of those countries, it's outside elites.
Outside elites. That's a bit vague. Does it specify who they mean?
Not explicitly, but the implication seems to be international actors, maybe NGOs, foreign governments, people not directly accountable to the local population.
Okay. Is there another quote tied to this?
Yes. Combating closed societies involves the building of democratic states and open societies, and embedding them in a structure which precludes certain kinds of behavior.
Embedding them in a structure which precludes certain kinds of behavior. How does the thread read that?
They interpret it to mean that democracy, in this Soros-based view they're describing, isn't just about what the people in that country want. It involves this external structure, maybe imposed by NATO or similar bodies, that stops certain things from happening, enforces certain norms.
The thread calls that ironic, right, saying it sounds less like democracy and more like external control.
Exactly. Which brings us back to NATO's purpose.
Which the thread argues shifted fundamentally.
Yeah, shifting towards assimilation, making countries fit this open society mold.
And the quote supporting that part.
It's attributed to Soros again. Therefore, if NATO has any mission at all, it is to project its power and influence into the region, and the mission is best defined in terms of open and closed societies.
Project its power and influence, defined in terms of open and closed societies.
So the argument is, NATO's job became less about defending its members and more about expanding eastward, getting involved in the internal politics of neighbors, especially post-Soviet states.
A fundamental change in mission, as perceived by the thread.
Okay. Then finally, the thread talks about this playbook in action and who benefits.
Right. It says Washington implemented this playbook.
And it lays out a timeline of NATO expansion, Partnership for Peace in '94.
Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, 99.
The Baltics, Romania, Bulgaria in '04, then the push for Ukraine and Georgia.
And Finland joining last year, Sweden on the way. It maps out that eastward expansion.
Exactly. And then comes this pretty extensive list of alleged beneficiaries of this whole model.
Who's on the list according to Data Republic?
It's long. NGO networks, open society foundations, USAID and NIDA are mentioned, bureaucrats, diplomats, international donors, foundations like the IMF and World Bank, private equity, multinationals.
So financial and corporate interests too.
Yeah. Western-aligned politicians, post-communist oligarchs who maybe benefited from privatization. Journalists, activists, professors, think tanks, big tech, mainstream media. It's quite a coalition.
And how did they supposedly benefit? What's the mechanism described?
The thread argues it's through things like increased influence, government contracts, career advancement, grant money, lending power,
Privatization opportunities, aid flows, positive press.
protection, funding, fellowships, access to markets, and crucially, controlling the narrative, setting the terms of the debate.
So it paints this picture of a self-reinforcing system where all these groups have a stake in promoting this specific open society framework.
That's the picture painted.
Yeah.
And the thread lands on a pretty stark final point.
Which is?
Basically that anyone who pushes back against this, anyone who advocates for more populist ideas or national sovereignty,
They get labeled.
yeah, labeled an enemy of democracy. Why? Because according to the thread's interpretation, George Soros said so. That's the final blunt assertion.
Okay, so let's just quickly recap what we've covered in this deep dive.
We looked at this Twitter thread that gained a lot of traction.
Right. And its central claim is that a 1993 essay by George Soros laid out a kind of playbook for NATO.
A playbook to shift NATO's mission from defense to actively promoting open societies.
We discuss the thread's definition of open society, the theory versus what it claims is the practice.
The role of foreign aid, the potential for intervention.
The idea of outside elites running things, and this whole list of groups that supposedly benefit from the model.
And it's really important to stress again, we've been laying out the arguments as presented in the thread and its interpretation of the Soros essay.
Exactly. Our aim was just to understand the claims being made in that specific online discussion.
Which leads to, I think, a really interesting question for you, the listener, to think about.
Yeah. When you hear these arguments about shaping countries externally, about the influence of international actors, how do you personally weigh that against the idea of national sovereignty?
Where's the line between promoting universal values, perhaps, and respecting a nation's right to choose its own path, even if that path looks different?
It's definitely complex. There aren't easy answers.
No, but engaging with these different viewpoints, trying to trace where ideas come from, and thinking critically about the information you encounter, that's always valuable, isn't it?
Absolutely. Especially in today's information environment.
In the heart of this nation, under skies so blue, there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true. From the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe. Conservative values in our souls, they're interweaved. With courage and with honor, we'll hold our ground. For freedom, for tradition, in this land we found. Cherish our Constitution, the words that set us free, the right to bear